Oh god, I'm reading the script back now. It is absolute dog shit. The interwar period between the First and Second World Wars is interesting to say the least. The rapid development of military technology and doctrine post World War I was impressive and also a little wacky, especially in tank designs. And that's what this video is going to be about. More specifically, the life-questioning story of Soviet tank development from basically the beginning to about the early war period. Pretty much every nation that's developed their own tank had a wild and outlandish design or two, including the Soviet Union, who I'd argue, at least in the interwar period, had one of, if not the weirdest go at it out of the main powers. Surprisingly enough, or unsurprisingly if you know literally anything about modern history, the story of Soviet AFVs actually starts with the British and French. I know, crazy, right? The Russian Empire frustratingly struggled to design and build its own tanks during World War I, and there was a whole war going on, and they weren't doing too hot, to say the least. Though they did put out a few head-scratching designs, is the wording that I'll use. Nonetheless, they decided to use the good old buy it from somebody else and went shopping in Britain and France, more specifically commissioning the building and purchase of 300 Renault tanks from France. So yay, we finally have tanks. Just as long as nothing crazy happens. What the fuck? As the absolute chaos that was the Russian Civil War began, Britain and France decided to intervene on the side of the whites, and it just so happened that they brought a few toys with them. Fast forward, the Reds end up winning, and now they have some captured tanks. Pretty much just some Mark IVs and some Renaults. From this point, nothing of note really happens in Russian tank development until 1924, when somehow they kind of came to the sudden realization that, tanks might come in handy in the event of, say, another European war. So the project was given national priority. In 1924, the Soviets began setting up to design and build their very first domestic tank. Behold, the amazing Russian T-18. Now, I know what you're probably saying to yourself, wait, Scout, that looks an awful lot like a Renault FT. And yeah, you're right. 'Cause it is. Do you remember earlier when the Civil War ended and they captured some Allied tanks? Well, after that happened, they disassembled some of them and shipped them off to Moscow for research purposes. That and the capture of a Fiat 3000 in 1920 from Poland led the Soviets to just say, fuck it, we'll copy their homework. Because why go through the process of working on a completely domestic design for something you've never built before that may not even work when you could just Control-C, Control-V and have a tank just like that? What's even more head-scratching about this period is that the Soviets still weren't even sure how they'd want to use a tank, doctrinally speaking. I'm serious, what the fuck are we going to use these things for? Are we supporting the infantry with it? Is it intended to be used independently? What are we doing here, guys? Building a tank while you're still trying to figure out what you want it to do is very inefficient for a couple different reasons. I'm sure I don't need to explain, but it just doesn't make sense. Who am I kidding? It's the Soviet Union, of course, they're just gonna do it anyway. It took them a while, but they eventually decided this thing would serve to be deployed alongside infantry in more of a support role. In this role, it wouldn't, in theory, be too terrible, besides the fact that it had a host of issues that were never quite figured out, such as a terrible speed, stuck at 10 miles per hour or 17 kilometers per hour. Which you could argue was acceptable at the time that it was built, but past the early 1930s, it was not acceptable at all. More issues included abysmal maneuverability and extremely poor gun sights, which will become a common theme in pretty much every Russian and Soviet tank we look at from here, which made its decent for the time 37mm gun practically ineffective. In 1929, a company of T-18s were sent to Manchuria to protect the Far East Railway and actually did really well at the Battle of... I'm not even going to try pronouncing that. I'm just going to throw that on screen. But in the aftermath, failed to cross an anti-tank ditch to pursue. Crossing trenches and ditches were also a considerable issue faced by T-18s. But to be fair, in this specific instance, it was an anti-tank ditch. After being retired as training vehicles in the 1930s, an unknown number of them were actually reactivated in July of 41 to bolster Soviet vehicle numbers in the wake of Operation Barbarossa and the German invasion. Notably being fitted with a new 45mm gun and seeing service on the Kiev-Voronezh line, with little to no information as to how they actually performed, but you could imagine how well these shit boxes did in the chaos of the Eastern Front. Just saying, if the most modern T-34s and KVs were having a hard time, imagine crewing this piece of dog shit. Anyway, moving on, we are now in the 1930s, where the Soviets carried out the vast majority of their tank development, at least prior to the Second World War. And good God, is it a decade of insane and possibly drug-induced designing in pretty much all nations, let alone the Soviet Union. It was a decade of trial and error, innovation and failure, and, again, copious amounts of the Walter White blue sky. But to keep this video from being millions of years in length, we're just gonna focus on the more notable developments and maybe save the other stuff for the future. Sorry, T-35. Maybe someday, you ugly, ugly bastard. The next notable development in the Soviet tank arsenal came in the form of the T-26. I'm sure deja vu is hitting once again, as you may be saying, wait, Scout, that looks an awful lot like the Vickers 6-ton. Yeah, because it is. Are you starting to see a pattern? In 1930, a Soviet committee toured around the UK to pick out vehicles and equipment for use in the Red Army. Upon visiting Vickers Armstrong, they took a very special interest in the 6-ton, and took a couple back with them. The T-26 is in fact a licensed copy of the Vickers, and it's also worth mentioning that the USSR was actually not the only nation to do this, most notably Poland's 7TP and Japan's Type 95 Ha-Go tanks also being derived from the Vickers, albeit in varying ways and forms. Initially, the Soviets had produced the Model 1931, which saw 2 machine gun turrets mounted as the vehicle's main armament, before switching to a single turret mounting the 45mm L-46 cannon in 1933. They did pretty alright in Poland, considering the absolute beatdown that entire situation was, but in Finland, on the other hand, they definitely did not have a great time. When the Soviets invaded Finland, they quickly found that the densely wooded environment confined armored vehicles like the T-26 almost exclusively to the very few roads the Soviets could access. And the confinement to these long columns marching down these roads often left them open to ambush by Finnish infantry to disastrous effects. Of course, by the time the Germans came knocking in June of 1941, the T-26 was long obsolete, and unsurprisingly, the vast majority of these vehicles were lost within the first few months, mostly from artillery and German air superiority as far as I can tell. Through 1941 to 42, they were gradually phased out through attrition, though some survived to be used, as far as I can tell, as late as 1944 on the Eastern Front, before last seeing combat in Manchuria against the Japanese. Overall, I'd say the T-26 was adequate early on to get the much-needed armor experience, but definitely overstayed its welcome, especially into the late 30s and early 40s, as technological development rapidly rendered it obsolete. Now last, but certainly not least, probably my favorite of the 3 discussed in this video because of the pure absurdity of its development and incredibly head-scratching story, introducing the BT series of tanks. And for once, oh my god, it's not a blatant copy of something else. They did it, guys! The Soviets, they managed to design their own tank, completely from scratch. Huh? Wait, what? The design's American. But, no, that's impossible. What? How could an American design be Soviet tank? This doesn't make any sense. Wait, let me grab my notes. Who the hell actually designed this thing anyhow? No fucking way. J. Walter Christie? What the fuck?
Yep, you heard that right. The Soviet BT series of tanks was originally designed by J. Walter Christie. That's right, the American automobile designer and race car driver with a unique obsession with going as fast as possible. Like, I'm not even kidding. This man gives off White Scar vibes with how predisposed he is with going fast as fuck, boy.
So, the question still stands, how did we get here? Well, Christie had an interest in the military arms sector and had tried on numerous occasions to sell his ideas to the US military from World War I throughout the entire interwar period, and was largely unsuccessful in these attempts, largely because, well, he was kind of a dick. And when reading through these stories and documents, I can definitely see they were not lying. Often, he refused to cooperate or compromise with the Army Ordnance Board that he was submitting his proposals to. And in 1930, his Christie tank was no different. The Army was just not interested in the idea for a variety of reasons. However, the Soviets had heard about the idea, and for some reason, they were interested. So they approached Christie about selling them the idea. Through what I can only imagine to be a whole host of legal shenanigans, Christie managed to sell his prototypes to the Soviet Union without prior approval from the State Department or the United States Army, simply marking the vehicles down as agricultural tractors. And there you have it. The Soviets have got themselves a new tank. So when I say BT tank, I'm really talking about a series of tanks, mostly the BT-2, the BT-5, and the BT-7, among other smaller scale variants, but to keep this video shorter, the development of the vehicles is outside the scope of this video, but it puts into perspective how much effort they put into improvement, although the Soviets did have different standards for improvement. You know, because they're the Soviet Union. Throughout its many variants, the BT-2 was equipped with a 37mm cannon, and the BT-5 and the BT-7 models were equipped with a 45mm, which gave it pretty decent firepower for the time. It also boasted a very impressive speed, being able to reach up to 52 km per hour on its tracks, and up to 72 on its road wheels. Yes, you heard that correct. The BT had a very unique feature that allowed for its tracks to be taken off, and for it to still be able to run on its road wheels, something that I'm not aware any other tank at the time, at least, was capable of. The intended use of the BT was actually pretty revolutionary from the rest of the Soviet armored force. Using its fast speed, it would engage in pinpoint breakthrough attacks to cause breakthroughs that it could then exploit to get behind enemy lines. Something that no doubt sounds a little familiar. And by all accounts, it seemed pretty equipped to handle that role well. The issue comes with how it was actually used. The BT was used in Poland to some great success, but again, like the T-26, it suffered greatly in Finland, also being restricted to the very few roads. I would argue that the BT had an especially rough time in Finland, seeing as it couldn't utilize any of its strengths effectively. Crewing a fast breakthrough tank just doesn't sound like fun in that kind of situation. The German invasion in 1941 really spelled the end of the BT. Being backpedaled on the defensive again meant that these vehicles suffered because, yet again, they were forced into a defensive role that they were never intended for. So, naturally, they fared poorly and were destroyed en masse by the advancing Germans. Though it is worth mentioning that the BT does end up inspiring the T-34 that would end up being the Soviet mainstay. Overall, I'd say the Soviets had one of the more interesting interwar developments, not even including the country's other wacky and weird concepts and developments that I skipped over for the sake of keeping the video short. The fact that Russia got into the tank development game later than most other nations, along with the complex political and economic climate they faced, meant that they worked with what they had, and ultimately, while early tank development mostly just came down to copying someone else's homework, they achieved what they had set out to do, and that was to build tanks. And it would set the groundwork for everything that came after this. A lot from this early period actually sticks around for decades if you look in the right places. So that's it. I simplified a lot and tried to make the video concise as to not confuse people. I also had to stop myself from talking about all the other ridiculous interwar stuff, such as that thing, and especially that thing. Depending on how this video actually does, I might make a part 2 and maybe even a part 3. And maybe someday we'll actually talk about the cursed shit. Yeah, so I know the production quality on this video is actually dog shit. And so I'd like to apologize for that and tell you that I will definitely make my videos a lot better as I move forward with this. But for now, I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please consider liking and subscribing. It really helps me out, and maybe I'll give you a cookie or something. Until then, I'm Red Scout, and I will see you gamers next time. God, I'm actually going to do it this time.